Last time we were together, we were talking about the Berlin Wall coming down, and let's move on to letter E, talking about the nuclear test ban treaty. We're talking about Kennedy's foreign policy. One of the things that he did here was he was able to successfully get an agreement between the United States, Russia, and Great Britain to stop testing nuclear weapons. The main reason they were worried, the main thing that they were worried about was World War III. They didn't want it to happen. And so to them, they felt like this was the best way to prevent that, because if you can't test a weapon, you don't really know if it works. So if you stop testing weapons, then potentially you stop creating the weapons. And they were somewhat concerned about what this could do to the environment, but more than anything, they were worried about World War III happening. And so the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty would actually say you have to take a big break, a long break from testing nuclear weapons. The next thing, Alliance for Progress, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a video right here. It's going to kind of carry part of his foreign policy and part of his domestic policy, which will carry into the rest of the lecture. So let me go over here and play this for you.
On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy is inaugurated as the 35th President of the United States. His inaugural address is one of the most iconic speeches in all of American history. He announces to the world that the American government and American society is now driven by a younger generation who has fought World War II and is ready to preserve liberty at any cost.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans. Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
It is a call to service in which he asks the American people to give back to their country instead of expecting something from it.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
The speech sets the tone for the Kennedy administration. John F. Kennedy's administration is often referred to as Camelot. This refers to the mythical but glamorous court of King Arthur, which was ruled by lords and ladies and the knights of the Round Table. In books, Camelot was a wonderful place because the future was always optimistic and anything seemed possible under the leadership of King Arthur. Like King Arthur, John F. Kennedy was young, handsome, charismatic, and a great leader. At his side was JFK's wife, Jacqueline Kennedy. Jackie became the biggest fashion icon in United States history. Raised in an aristocratic East Coast family, Jackie was bred for high class. Women across the country idolized her for her fashion, glamour, etiquette, taste, and education. John, Jackie, and their two young children, Caroline and John Jr., were the image of a perfect family. And it seemed like every day new pictures came out of the White House of President Kennedy being a devoted father. All of these factors led to the creation of the Kennedy mystique, or this ideal image of the Kennedys as the perfect American family. The Kennedy mystique made President Kennedy and his wife Jackie very popular, both at home and around the world.
Part of the Kennedy mystique of Camelot was his team of advisors. They were known as the best and the brightest. They were young, talented, fresh-faced, and forward-thinking. He added Harvard professors, business executives, and charity heads. Two of his most famous cabinet members were Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and Attorney General, his brother, Robert Kennedy. JFK's team of young intellectuals motivated young Americans to get involved in society and politics. Once in office, Kennedy begins his push for progress. His plan was called the New Frontier. Kennedy's first focus was fixing the economy. By 1960, the U.S. was in a recession and unemployment was at 6%. Kennedy employed two measures to help fix this. First, he enacted deficit spending. JFK cut taxes to allow Americans to have more income to spend. He also increased defense spending by 20%. Kennedy focuses his spending more on conventional weapons like submarines, missiles, and aircraft carriers, and moved away from spending on nuclear weapons. His second focus was on creating jobs and poverty relief. Kennedy increased the minimum wage to $1.25 an hour to boost consumerism. He also increased unemployment benefits and sent aid to poor cities.
Internationally, the Kennedy administration sent economic and educational aid to poor countries in order to fight the influence of communism. In Kennedy's eyes, the communists didn't have to be fought with bullets, bombs, and guns, but instead could be fought by showing poor countries the popular appeal of capitalism and democracy. To help in this endeavor, President Kennedy created the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps sent over 30,000 college-age volunteers to poor nations around the world in order to help their populations. Most Peace Corps volunteers became teachers, health aides, nurses, engineers, and helped develop third world countries. Because poorer nations with more desperate people were more susceptible to falling to communism, President Kennedy felt by developing third world countries with American aid, it could help prevent these poor countries from turning to communism and keeping more allies on America's side. President Kennedy also approved the Alliance for Progress. Focused particularly on the Western Hemisphere, the Alliance for Progress sent over $12 billion to Latin American countries in order to help build their infrastructure so they could be better trade partners with the United States, but also deter these countries from turning to communism as the political system.
In 1962, Kennedy boldly states the United States will beat the Soviets to the moon.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
JFK immediately boosts funding in education. His ambitious space challenge sees increased funding in scholarships and university research. Math and science programs take off. Funding also leads to the creation of NASA and the space race. JFK boosts funding to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Within months, an American, Alan Shepard, is in space, and a program to put a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth is on.
The 1960s were off to a booming start. With a charismatic leader in charge, Americans felt inspired. The economy was turning around, American prestige around the world was growing, and the United States had their sights set on beating the Soviets to the moon. With America re-energized, President Kennedy was ready to lead the United States to great things in the 1960s.
But I believe that the times require imagination and courage and perseverance. I'm asking each of you to be pioneers towards that new frontier.
All right, so hopefully that kind of gives you a short idea of some of the stuff that we're talking about here and gives you a little bit more visual aid, breaks up the lecture a little bit, I guess. But anyway, the Alliance for Progress, as they were saying, was Kennedy's plan to financially invest in Latin America with the sole goal that a lot of times if you have a country that is poor, poor countries lend itself to dictatorships, which means that they're more susceptible to becoming influenced heavily by the communists. And so if we financially invest in Latin America, it would create better trade with them and it would give them more structure and show them the appeal of being capitalistic and democratic and keep them away from communists. The other thing that he created was the Peace Corps, and here's that flag there. If you guys noticed it, that the flag has a star, which is kind of converting into a dove. And what it was is it was college-age volunteers all around the world to help educate and build up third world countries. We've talked about what a third world country is before. That is one that it lacks technology, that one that lacks trade, education. And these college-age kids were able to, give 1 year, 2 years, or whatever to this program, and they would pay for their flights and they would pay for their, travel expenses. And these individuals would help educate the individuals in these third world countries. They would build bridges, they would build hospitals, they would build schools, do all sorts of things, work in the hospitals as well to try to, I guess, maybe fix any bad reputation that America's had all over the world. That was kind of the idea behind it. I actually know a couple of people who have done the Peace Corps. You can actually still do the Peace Corps if you wanted. It's still around today. When it first got started, I knew a couple of people that had done it in the 1960s and 70s and said it was a great program. They actually ended up in Nepal, I believe, is where they ended up. But anyway, here's a picture of Kennedy talking to some of these kids, trying to recruit them. And this is the sign that they used, the classic Uncle Sam with I Want You for the U.S. Peace Corps. And now let's move on to his domestic policy. Domestic means at home. And one of the things that they called it was Camelot. And at the beginning of his presidency, they gave this nickname to his cabinet and his term, mainly because he was young. He was like that King Arthur. He was like the guy that was leading them into a new era. And what he was trying to do is almost get rid of the old, curmudgeon, uh, older people that worked in the government. Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense were always generally older, and he wanted to go different. People that weren't as tied to Washington politics. And so he got people that had worked as the CEO of General Motors. They worked as a Harvard professor. They worked as top lawyers. And he tried to stay away from people that were entrenched in Washington. And they did this, and they called it Camelot, again, as the video said, mainly because he was young. His wife was young as well, and they just seemed like the perfect couple. And he tended to hire the people that would work for him as far as the Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, all of those, Attorney General, the best and the brightest. And one of those was his brother, Robert Kennedy, who served as the Attorney General, which, if you guys remember, the Attorney General's job is to be the nation's lawyer. And I'll make sure you guys get that written down. If you have to pause, feel free. But the best and the brightest is what they called it, because he wanted to go different than what Washington had had. This is a picture of him and his brother. He is on the right, his brother's on the left. And a lot of you guys know that Kennedy was assassinated, but maybe perhaps you did not know that Robert Kennedy, his brother, was assassinated about 5 years after John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Robert was assassinated as well, as he was trying to run for president. So we'll hopefully get to that story later on. He also hired Robert McNamara as his Secretary of Defense. Robert McNamara came from the business world and served as Secretary of Defense for him and President Johnson. Became very important, specifically during the Vietnam time period. There's a picture of Robert McNamara and President Kennedy sitting in Washington at his office. And you also had Dean Rusk, which was his Secretary of State. And Dean Rusk came from, again, an educated background that was not necessarily politically tied. And there's a picture of Dean Rusk down here. This is actually Robert McNamara here, Kennedy and Dean Rusk. And so, again, these guys were not ones that were entrenched in the, Washington affairs. They hadn't been in politics their whole entire life. And so he was trying to get something to be a little bit different. And letter B, the New Frontier, is what they named his domestic policy, the New Frontier. And again, as the video had stated in President Kennedy's speech, he was saying to people, we want to go on this new frontier. And when you think about a frontier, you think about like the West. We talked about that way earlier this year, back in like chapter 4 and 5. But it was like uncharted territory. And that's basically what he kept trying to have the spirit of optimism to Americans, saying, we have all the potential in the world to create whatever we want for ourselves. This is our frontier. We are in a new frontier. Let's take our trajectory someplace completely different that no other country has even messed with. And that's one of the things that he tried in this New Frontier program as he created it. And again, it was almost found in his inaugural speech when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Basically saying, how can I volunteer? How can I help my country become the best country that is out there? And so he really tried to push for this New Frontier. So we're going to stop here today, and then we'll finish up New Frontier, and we'll also talk about his assassination on the next lecture. I hope you guys have a tremendous weekend. It was good seeing you guys earlier this week on our Google Meet. We'll have another scheduled Google Meet next week, and it should be good. Talk to you guys later.